Kingfisher, as an oil field, is operated by CNOOC Uganda Limited on behalf of joint ventures. And so Kingfisher Development Area is operated by CNOOC Uganda Limited. Oil resources are finite. What that basically means that they are depletable. So with time, as we produce them, it gets depleted. This particular place was chosen because, as we know it from our basic geography, there is something we call, health movement that creates what we call a graben and a host block.
Welcome to yet another edition. Today, let's look at the Kingfisher project. Located in the southeast of Lake Albert, Kingfisher Development Area is one of the Uganda's key oil and gas projects. The name is derived from a fish-eating bird, Kingfisher, common there. It is in Buhuka, flat, Kyangwaali in Kikuube District. UNOC, as the government nominee, holds 15% participating interest in the project. Other partners are CNOOC Uganda Limited and Total Energies EP Uganda, holding 28.33% and 56.67% respectively. The Kingfisher Development Area covers the Kingfisher field located in Kikuube, with plans for future tie in Mputa-Nzizi-Waraga fields in Kaiso-Tonya Hoima District. The project will produce 40,000 barrels of crude oil per day during peak production. The front-end engineering and design for the project was completed in February 2018. The environmental and social impact assessment was completed and certificate issued by the National Environment Management Authority in 2020. The final investment decision of Kingfisher Development Area was announced in February 2022, alongside that for the sister project Lenga and the East African crude oil pipeline. Let's have a look at the Kingfisher Development Area.
Kingfisher Development Area is being taken forward, or Kingfisher as an oil field is operated by CNOOC Uganda Limited on behalf of joint ventures. These joint venture partners include Total Energies EP Uganda, includes Uganda National Oil Company, that is taking forward the government interest in those licenses. And so Kingfisher Development Area is operated by CNOOC Uganda Limited. Oil resources are finite. What that basically means that they are depletable. So with time, as we produce them, it gets depleted. But while we do that, we have to ensure that it is being managed in a responsible manner so that we can get back returns on investment. You should know that whenever we have a resource like this, we always want to attract the best investor to come and try and develop it. And that's why we look for one that has not only money, because that's very important, but also the technology to develop the resources that have been discovered. So particularly in Kingfisher Development Area, the map I showed you earlier on, you can now start to put certain things in perspective. The area that you have seen graded on the other side, that is a central processing facility. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it shortly. And then the other one is the rig, which we are going to visit late. As we leave this place, we shall visit that place too, so that you can see and appreciate. That's the rig that the president came and launched in February. And it's already in active drilling. I think they have reached the TD recently. And they're doing, I think, wireline logging now. I don't know whether they've completed that, but we shall visit that and we'll be able to see. Why did the early explorers decide to come in this place? It's important for you to understand that there are always precursors to exploration. Why did they come in this place and not Nakasongola, and not in Mbale, and not in Gulu or somewhere in Mubende, but this particular place? This particular place was chosen because, as we know it from our basic geography, there is something we call, health movement that creates what we call a graben and a host block. The host block is something like an escarpment. You can see this escarpment route. I have mentioned earlier on that as we are coming down, we were moving through those meandering roads. Those meandering roads never used to be there. We used to move from up there about 10 years ago from the escarpment. It would take us about 2 hours to go down the flats. And all the communities that you see here used to do the same, whether they are bringing their merchandise, whether they are going to do grazing or they are going to do anything up the escarpment, they used to walk down. And ladies will carry things on their head coming down. So this road that has been constructed here has enabled to not only help the project to be handled better and bring equipment and be able to develop this project in a better way, but it has also improved the livelihood of people. So going back to the story of why they chose this place. Whenever we are looking for oil, we don't look for oil in what we call crystalline rocks. We look for oil in sedimentary rocks. Crystalline rocks are rocks like, volcanic rocks. Those are crystallized. When you see the results of those volcanoes depositing some of those, that what remains there is crystalline rock. We don't look for oil there because they are very fine particles. They are not good, but we look for oil in sedimentary basins. How do sedimentary basins? Sedimentary basins, those sedimentary rocks, as we know, are basically small fragments of rock that have been deposited over a long period of time. As results of friction, fragmentation of rocks over a long period of time, they get deposited mainly, usually, around water bodies like the lake, like this. So, when the rifting took place, there were a number of rocks that were deposited earlier on. Those rocks have what we call organic matter. And I'm going to describe something which is very important for you to understand why we came in this place. I told you about the oil seep before. Whenever we discover an oil seep in an area, it confirms one thing. It confirms that we have what we call a petroleum system, a working one at that. Now, a petroleum system, for you to appreciate what it is, it has mainly 3 or 4 basic components. What is a source rock? A source rock is basically a rock that has organic matter that has been buried deep, heated over a long period of time, and it has produced oil. Now, that oil doesn't remain in that rock. Some of them might remain, but occasionally, and most often than not, it actually migrates. The oil migrates upwards. Now, it's important for you to know also that when oil actually is produced, they have to migrate. How do they do that? They migrate through fractures. Fractures are the things that the rock, when the rock is in the surface and it breaks down, it creates those fractures. And out of those fractures, there are pathways through which oil can migrate. Now, when that oil migrates upwards and does not find any stoppage along the path, it will reach the surface. Fractures, this escarpment as we are looking at it right now, that is an escarpment, this is the graben. This is a fracture. And in the subsurface, this same fracture goes all the way and we call it a fault system. Now, when oil comes through those fractures and they do not find anything that stops it, it comes all the way to the surface. And that's what we call an oil seep. Those are the oil seeps I was talking about. We discovered as government in Chivuku, we discovered in Kavyosi, I talked about that, we discovered in Chiviro. That is what the early explorers found. And as soon as they found that, they were excited. But that's not the complete story. The story goes on, and what is important is that when we have actually had that migration has taken place and we have seen an oil seep, what is now important is to try and find something called an oil pool. And how does an oil pool form? As the oil moves from the source rock, they have to be contained in a reservoir. Reservoirs are better rocks in terms of property. Why? Because they have conduits of voids within them that can contain that oil. And if that oil is not contained, that's when it comes to the surface. How does it get contained? It means that we must be able to have something called a cap rock. A cap rock is basically one that ensures that we contain the oil in the reservoir so that it doesn't come to the surface. If that cap rock is compromised, that means it is broken, it creates a fault, and there is a conduit for it to come to the surface. But if it is properly contained, then we get what we call an oil pool. It is the oil pool that the explorers look for in all these areas. Around the 60s and the 70s, we didn't have enough technology for us to be able to see the subsurface with our own naked eye. The technologies have been improving over time for the last 5, 6, 7 decades, that we have something called a seismic survey that we do in order to acquire what we know as seismic data. Seismic data is basically an X-ray of the subsurface in simple terms. You remember how you go to an hospital and X-ray your chest, They X-ray your chest, they see whether your bone is broken or not. That is how we also image in the subsurface. We send signals down. Those signals are waves. Those waves bounce off rock fragments, and those rock layers bounce off at different velocities. Those different velocities are recorded at the surface. And that helps us to determine the structures that in the subsurface and identify oil pools. When we identify, then we drill. So that's, in a nutshell, in a very crushed way, how oil is formed and how we look for them. We are drilling for oil, but how are we drilling the oil? Now, I want to tell you, in Kingfisher, we only have, in the development phase, we are looking at having 4 pads. But those 4 pads are having multiple wells, 31 wells to be precise. 20 of them are going to be producers, 11 of them are going to be injectors. Now, in the olden days, what used to happen is that if you have those 31 wells, you will go creating pads everywhere so that you drill those 31 wells. But now technologies have improved. We do not have to drill everywhere. Why? When you drill everywhere, you increase a lot of footprints. And remember, we have the local communities that are living here. We have people that are working here and coming out. And we have also the ecosystem that we have to preserve because it's a natural ecosystem. So you want to reduce your footprint as much as possible. So what do? We drill what we call multiple wells on one well pad. And so you will find that on one well pad here, there will be maybe 5, 6, even in some of the cases like you will see on the north, up to 12 or 16 wells on one well pad. That is to ensure that we reduce the surface footprint. So if someone asks you how is the project right now trying to manage footprints in the environment, because we are working in the park, we are working in local community, protecting the environment. That is one of the ways we are trying to protect the environment. So now we can drill from one part very many wells, and those wells will target different reservoir locations. Now, another thing I want to tell you is that you see we are drilling from the surface. But but this Kingfisher field, most of it is actually under the water. But we are not going to affect the water. Why? Because it is about 2-3 kilometers deep. That is where the reservoirs are. And we are drilling from the surface and we are deviating towards the reservoir which is under the water. That in itself is a modern technology that we couldn't do in the last 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. We couldn't do that because over time we have improved in technology. We can now drill better, we can now complete better, we can now reach we can do extended reach in our well drilling, and that has enabled us to be able to even develop an area like this, which could have naturally been affected by the fact that we have water bodies here. How would you drill a vertical well easily on water? Yes, you can. Technology now allows us to drill on the water, but we can do that in a more safer manner by drilling from the surface. So that's, in a nutshell, the story. I talked about the source rock, and you know the way the Albertine ground, we are in the border. When the British came and when they were leaving, at some point they were trying to demarcate the border. And when we are talking about sharing water, the best customary law, international customary law, demands that actually when you have water body like this and you're sharing with another state, we use what we call equidistance, approach to delimitation or border marking. That basically means that we look for the middle point, and then from your shores to the other shores, you divide by 2 and you take half of it and the other half of it. And the government of Uganda was cognizant of that much earlier. That's why we signed an agreement with Congo in 1990 for that cooperation. But at the end of the day, someone wants to ask, we are at the border. You may ask, how about if we discover tomorrow, that our oil actually extends to the Congo? I first of all want to give you comfort that actually the source rock I talked about, our seismic data that we have acquired right now, shows that we are tilted. We have a tilted block here in Kingfisher that is tilted something like this. It's tilted more, it's deep towards the Congo side, and it's elevated towards the Ugandan side. What that means is that with the concept of buoyancy, oil will always flow upwards as a result of something known as buoyancy. And because of buoyancy, it is always known that water is less dense, oil is less dense than water. So it means that oil will be floating on top of water. Because oil floats on top of water, you will always have a tendency of having a pool with water below and gas on top. Okay? And what happens to that? So when you have a source rock which is tilted and it is down south, it's down deep, it means that the migration will always be going towards the up deep of that structure. So generally speaking, one would say because the organic matter is cooked in the source rock, that should be the kitchen. And so if the oil pool is being produced up deep of that structure, then you can, by analogy, you could say that the oil is being cooked in the kitchen and the dining hall is in Uganda. And you will guess where the kitchen would be. So that's the first comfort. The second comfort is, should we then find that actually we have oil across the border of Uganda and Congo, we do what we call international unitization. Because we already have an agreement with Congo, it means that we can have an international unitization. And international unitization can take 3 components. You can decide an authority like ours, like the Petroleum Authority, to manage that resource on behalf of the 2 states. The second one, you can decide and say that one of the states operate and manage the resources, and then the other state gets a fair share of their part. You can as well decide that you have both states actually managing jointly. At the end of the day, which model works for such kind of international unitization is a subject of negotiation between the 2 states. And so that is something that we are cognizant of, and most often than not, people ask us that, assuming we are right now at the border, because the border is not far from here, if we find that this oil actually reaches Congo, what do we do? That's how we would be able to manage it. So in a nutshell, that is what is happening in this place, and I would be glad to answer certain specific questions as far as the project is concerned before I invite my colleagues, CNOOC, to come and tell us more about especially how they are working with the community, and then we shall be able to go and see some of the projects that they have done in the community, like the water treatment here for the community and some of the livelihood restoration programs that they have, and how the community is coexisting with this project. So those are, in a nutshell, what you need to know about the Kingfisher project. Like I mentioned earlier on, Kingfisher will be producing at 40,000 barrels per day. And at 40,000 barrels per day, we expect to produce for about four years, and then we start going down, the production will come down. But that production will be supported by the Kaiso-Tonya fields that are meant to come at least 4 or 5 years after first oil. And the Kaiso-Tonya fields include Mputa, includes Nzizi, and includes Waraga. All those have production license currently, and those will be used to support the production at Kingfisher. The central processing facility is a facility that is used to try and improve the quality of our crude oil. Now, it's important for you to understand that When we produce crude oil, we produce them with a lot of impurities. When we produce, we do not necessarily want water, but water will always come out with oil. We do not necessarily need gas in our oil. So we want to reduce the amount of gas as much as possible, separate it basically. We also want to remove things like rock cuttings and fragments and so on that come from the subsurface. Now, you have always had things, terms like Brent crude in the North Sea, West Texas Index in the Gulf of Mexico, the Nigerian light, and so on and so forth. All those are blends of crudes that are improved. They are improved. Why? Because the properties allow them to be sold as a lump sum. It means that if, for example, Uganda wants to sell its crude in the international market, and in a particular market, maybe in the Middle East, maybe in Europe, they must be able to bring up their crude, improve that property of the crude to the state that the international community can be able to buy. So it's the same thing let me give an example. If you're going to sell your tomatoes in market in Nakasero, and then they say for each tomato you bring, it must be at least 200 grams. Of course, in the garden you have tomatoes of 250, 25, 550 grams. So you have to make sure that you sieve that tomato to 200 grams for you to be able to sell at Nakasero market. It's the same thing here. Crude oils come from, much as they all come from organic matter, they are not of the same property. Some of them have very high sulfur content. You want to remove that completely because they are corrosive to our pipelines and so on. So the more, for example, you have sulfur content, that is an impurity in the oil industry term, you get very low price for crude in the international market. But what the central processing facility does is to remove all those impurities that we do not want and make our crude better and a better quality for us to be able to sell in the international market. That's the objective of the central processing facility. It is different from the refinery. The refinery now takes the crude which we have processed from here, and we have removed all the impurities and breaks it down to useful products. Those products that they are always called white products, the petrol, the diesel, the kerosene, the jet fuel, those are the useful products that the refinery does. So that is not done at the central processing facility. The central processing facility is to improve the quality of the crude, remove all the impurities that we don't work, reduce the amount of water, and send a better quality crude to the refinery. Of course, even when it goes to the pipeline, that pipeline is going to load on a vessel somewhere in the Indian Ocean and transport it to a refinery somewhere in Europe, Middle East, or elsewhere. That's what happens. As far as we are aware right now, we do not have any claims from Congo as far as this project is concerned, because there is no evidence right now that our resources actually cross the border. If that happens, we have a mechanism through which we shall be able to develop our field, and those three mechanisms I've mentioned are options that we have at the table. It's always at the discretion of the countries to negotiate and find what is best for us to be able to employ. It is in the law that before any production license is awarded, the company must submit what we call a field development plan. That field development plan includes a component of decommissioning. But also, in the law, it is required that after a certain period of time, when we start production, the companies must start depositing money for decommissioning. Remember, decommissioning is one of those expenditures that no company wants. That is why most of the big companies around the world, when they start production and they reach a certain stage and they realize that the economics of the projects have gone down, they tend to sell off to smaller companies. Why? Because they want to transfer the obligation of decommissioning to another company. And governments have become much more stricter these days and much more clever and say, okay, in fact, for example, in the UK, if you're a company that is operating in the North Sea, even if you sell off your interest to another company, you will still remain with that obligation of decommissioning. It means that if I sell company A, sell to company B, when government is looking for decommissioning money and is looking for an obligation to take somebody to book for decommissioning, you A, much as you have sold to B, you're still liable for that decommissioning to happen. So governments have over time become more clever and try to learn from the industry to ensure that we cover our backs. Because someone can come, put up this facility, mess up these multi-million tons of steel that is going to be put here as pipeline, as central processing facility. If there is no oil here, it's useless. Much as somebody will say, we'll take it to the mill and, you know, probably get steel out of it and create other things. But as far as the oil industry terms is concerned, it's useless. Because you have to removing it, the cost of removing it, the cost of transportation and making it, taking it all the way, you cannot get that back useless. So somebody needs to take that obligation, and companies don't like spending money at the tail end, but it's an obligation they must take. So as Uganda, we have taken care of that. It's a threat that we saw recently. And one of the things that we have done during the study of placement of this facility is to study how many meters does the lake needs to rise in order to be able to affect this. Indeed, when the flooding took place, this is pad 1. We are going to reach there. It's near the permanent camp. So what you see there is the permanent camp. That is pad 1. That is pad 2. Pad 3 is there, where you see, and then pad 4 is a bit up north. So when it flooded, and then there's a water obstruction also around there. So when it flooded, it actually affected a little bit of that side. And flooding is a natural, it's a natural process. None of us can stand against flooding. However, we have to mitigate it. Now, our facilities have been put, I don't know, I don't want to give, Andrew, do you know how far the CPF is from the water, from the shoreline?
I'm not sure, but the flooding doesn't reach the CPF.
It doesn't reach the CPF.
Never reached the CPF.
It has never reached the CPF. It can't reach the CPF. But I want to tell you that we have put mitigation factor. The lake will need to rise, I think, more than 10 meters or so for it to actually affect the CPF. And that is quite a big amount of water for it to be able to flood. That would probably mean it's flooding the whole of CPF. But 10 meters is, with the reservoir of the Albertine Graben, is quite some flooding. It has never happened before in the last few years, decades history. So there's that we have taken care of. Except the facility like the water abstraction facility, that has to touch the lake actually, because we are getting the water for the production and for treatment and the production from the lake. So that is the one that possibly might be affected. But it's something that we pray doesn't happen, but we have put mitigation factors to try and avoid that. It has a noise cancelling mechanism. That's the state-of-the-art rig. And I allow Prosi to again talk about it. We will not hear sound even when we go there. You won't hear, but it is drilling. It's active. I don't know what they're doing right now, but we'll find out. Prosi will tell us. But that rig has a noise cancellation mechanism, so it will you will never hear it because we have planned for it because of this area. Prosi.
They asked you about the distance.
question?
Yeah?
Yes, about
yes.
The breeding of the fish and the waves and the breeding is going to be answered by CNOOC.
Okay. Yes, the breeding will be answered by CNOOC.